All right, 4:02, no time like the present. Let's go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone to Water Wise Gardening for Birds and Pollinators. I want to thank you all for taking the time out of your Tuesday afternoon, evening to join us, especially for us Sonoma County folks, a particularly beautiful Tuesday afternoon. So we really appreciate you spending your time with us. Also want to express gratitude to the city of Cotati, um, with whom it is possible for us to host this free event. So many thanks to them. My name is Connor Devane. I'm a programs coordinator for Daily Acts. I'm joined today by my colleague Liz and our special guest, Veronica Bowers. So before we get started, just a few things to go over. Um, some of you may be familiar with Daily Act. Some of you, this may be your first event with us. So I just want to speak a little bit to who we are and what we do. So Daily Acts is a small but mighty environmental education nonprofit. We work to inspire transformative action that create more connected, equitable, and climate resilient communities. We believe in the power of our daily actions to reconnect people to self, to place, and community, which in turn helps heal society and the planet. We do a lot of different things. In true Petaluma fashion, we have many eggs in many baskets. But we have a three-pronged approach to holistically addressing the climate crisis in Sonoma County. So first, we spread solutions and models through programs like this one to offer people skills and tools to conserve resources while they're growing food, habitat, medicine, community, soil carbon, conserving water, and more. We also invest in strengthening community leadership through our Leadership Institute and our Eco to Schools program. We work in coalition with networks and alliances to advance social and environmental justice here in Sonoma County and beyond. And all of that kind of coalesces into building public and political will, mobilizing our community's voice to in favor of climate justice policies. So yeah, there's a lot of different things we've got going on. Before we get into the good stuff here, just a quick note. I'm sure most of us are all too familiar with the workings of Zoom video conferencing at this point, but we're in a webinar format, so unfortunately we can't see your beautiful faces. So if you want to communicate with us and to all the rest of our attendees this afternoon, you're going to want to use the chat box, which many of you already have been engaging with. Thank you for that, by the way. You want to make sure that your recipient is set to all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see what you have to share. We're going to have a Q&A period after the presentation. So as questions occur to you throughout, feel free to enter them in the Q&A box. And we will have those at the ready when the time comes. Most likely, we're going to save all of those till the end just to keep the presentation flowing. In the off chance that something super relevant comes up, Liz and I might interject with it, but just know that we've got it waiting for you at the end. Lastly, any resources and links that come up in the presentation, we will email to you either tomorrow or the following day, along with a recording of this presentation and most likely a few other helpful resources from us at Daily Acts. So without any further ado, I have the great pleasure of passing off the mic and the screen share to Veronica Bowers. Veronica, thanks so much for being here today.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Hello, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and launch into my presentation. So my face is going to disappear, but hi, welcome. I'm so glad that you're all here. And thank you so much, Daily Acts, for, again, partnering with us on this really important topic. I'm excited to share it with our community. Okay, how's that?
Perfect.
Super. All right. So I am Veronica Bowers. I am the director and founder for a nonprofit organization in Sebastopol called Native Songbird Care and Conservation. And we are a state and federally licensed wildlife hospital. We're the only wildlife hospital in Northern California specializing in the care of native songbirds. We're 100% devoted exclusively to their care. So don't try and bring us a raptor. We don't do those. We care for about 1,000 songbirds a year from all over Sonoma County and beyond, actually. So we take birds as far as Shasta County all the way down to San Jose. During the baby season, we specialize in a certain subset of songbird species. So migratory songbirds and insectivorous songbirds are expertise that we have and resources and facilities that we have here dedicated to those species. So we support 11 other partner organizations who are general species facilities. And they will transfer some of these little tricky insectivores to us, which helps the birds get the specialized care they need, but it also frees up the facilities and resources at those other organizations so they can care for animals like raccoons and red-tailed hawks and Canada geese, etc. So we work collaboratively with a lot of wildlife groups. We have two missions. One, obviously, is to care for the injured, orphaned, and ill songbirds in our community with the goal of releasing them back out to the wild. But the other arm of our mission is educational outreach and community engagement. And so our goal there is to help our community learn about the songbirds in our area and ways that they can help those songbirds in their own backyard to ensure the health, well-being, and safety of our local songbird populations. And so one tool that we use in the spirit of community engagement and educational outreach is our native plant garden here at Native Songbird Care. It's called the Songbird Sanctuary Gardens, and it's a little over 1.5 acres of native plants. And in tandem with our garden, we also do community presentations, which you are attending today, to talk about something that we just sort of generically call wildscaping. So the premise of that is not only to support our native songbirds in our gardens and our green spaces, but also to support our pollinators and other insects and all manner of biodiversity once you start creating a healthy ecosystem in your backyard. So we'll talk a little bit more about that today. Oopsie. So Native Songbird Care and Conservation is primarily a 100% volunteer-driven organization. We do have a couple of seasonal temporary staff during the summertime, but most of us are volunteer throughout the year. And I'll just throw this little sales pitch in right here to say that if you are interested in joining our work, we do have a new volunteer informational meeting coming up on March 25th. It is going to be a virtual meeting, and you'll learn more about the various opportunities that we have here to get involved. COVID has made things interesting, but we have found some ways to safely bring on new volunteers and engage them in part of our mission to help the native songbirds in our area. Okay, so now on to songbirds, pollinators, and more. So my goal today is just to share with you some tips that will help you foster biodiversity in your own backyard. So I am by no means an expert on pollinators, bees, butterflies, or otherwise, but I do know some very effective essentials to support them in our backyards. And I know a lot about songbirds, and I know quite a bit about native plants, and I'm learning more and more every day. So those are the topics that we're going to talk about today, and I hope that you leave feeling inspired and excited to implement some of these ideas in your own garden or a community garden or other public space. So if you're reading the news at all about what's going on in the world today, these are some of the headlines that have sort of plagued us over the last couple of years. 1/3 of bird populations have been lost in the last 40 years, and that is represents a wide range of species, but most of those birds in decline are our songbird species, some of which are even common backyard birds whose populations are in decline. We've read about the insect apocalypse that we know is occurring globally. Insects are not yucky, they're essential to our well-being and healthy ecosystems. So when we know they're in decline, we know that there's a problem there. And things like Earth's 6th mass extinction, bee populations declining, climate change, our Western monarch population is on the brink of collapse. All of these things are very discouraging headlines, but there are things that we can do as individuals that will go a long way toward helping solve some of these problems. So right now, Mother Earth needs a little love from us. And let's talk about how we can start with giving her some love in our own backyard. So this is where change can begin. I am a huge advocate of the power of native plants. And just to give you a brief summary of my journey, when we bought our property over 20 years ago in Sebastopol, it had just a bunch of ornamentals on it. I was very excited to move here because I thought, oh, a couple of acres, we're going to have all of these wonderful songbirds living in our garden. And that actually wasn't the case. They would come through and use the bird feeder and the bird bath, and then they would move on. And as I became involved in our local Madrone Audubon chapter and started birding out in our wildlife areas and our preserves, I was learning more about habitat, learning more about native plants, and then really learning more about that essential connection between our native songbirds and native plants. So I went to work and slowly started replacing all of those ornamentals in our garden with native plants. It was very haphazard at first. I didn't have any awareness of plant communities at that time. If it was native to California, I stuck it in the ground. But fast forward to 21 years later, we have a thriving bird community here. We have an amazing array of butterflies, all kinds of insects. No pesticides are used, fertilizers aren't used. Everything has found its own kind of balance in maintaining itself. So it's a thriving ecosystem. And that is all due to the use of native plants in our garden. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So you can make a really positive impact in the greater world by using native plants, but most especially locally in your own backyard. So when we choose to use native plants in our gardens, we are, just by virtue of using those plants, restoring habitat for birds, pollinators, and other members of the biodiverse community. We're able to increase natural areas to provide homes and food for wildlife. And we can create areas of wildlife habitat that connect to larger green spaces. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And also, when we're using California native plants, because they're California native plants and because they have evolved with the climate and ecology of California, we reduce our water usage. And we can also go a little in the direction of combating climate change impacts by using native plants and some of the practices that you observe when you're working with natives. There we go. So this is an image of the lower 48 states in 1940. And all of that shading from green to light green to red to orange represents housing density or lack of housing density. And you can see that a lot of those bright orange spots and yellow to light green are areas where there was, at that time, a lot of development, urban sprawl, and human habitation going on there. The darker green parts of the country don't necessarily represent wildlands and untouched landscapes. They're probably more agricultural use and just haven't been as heavily populated by human structures yet. But you can see there's quite a loss of natural areas for our wildlife. And then fast forwarding into 2030, you can see that there's more orange areas, more yellow, more light green. So humans have really populated the lower 48 states. There are very few natural areas left for our wildlife. And what that means is they don't have a lot of the resources that they need to succeed and lead healthy lives. But if their ecosystems aren't healthy and they're not doing well, that also impacts our human health and the health of the climate. So if we zoomed in and looked at some of those yellow and orange areas, we would probably see a lot of this. This is a pretty traditional urban, suburban environment. And it is, from a bird's perspective, it's not a very welcoming environment. There's just a lot of impermeable surfaces with concrete and asphalt and roofing material. And we see some little patches of green in there, but those little patches of green are predominantly lawns and ornamental vegetation. So, ornamental trees, ornamental shrubs, non-native flowers and such. So not a lot of living landscape in those gardens, if you will. There isn't really anything that provides a reliable food source for our native birds or for our insects. So probably a lot of the past criteria that was used to formulate those more traditional gardens was really decorative value. Things that, looked pretty. Maybe there were some functional elements like hedges that would form a privacy screen. But if those materials weren't native plants, but really, true ornamentals like you might find in the Home Depot nursery section, that's really it. Those plants would only address aesthetics from a human needs perspective and not really what would be of any ecological value. But if we switched it up and we found a selection of native plants that also addressed our human need for aesthetics and decorative value and some functional things like screens, we would also have the other added benefit that native plants bring to the table, and that is establishing food web value, wildlife appreciation, carbon sequestration, soil restoration even, and watershed value. So there's a way to find a balance between our human needs and the needs of an ecosystem. So here's a little Google Earth map that is of where I live in Sebastopol. And that little yellow area is actually pointing to our property. So our little 2 acres backs up against a conservation easement. There's a creek back there. There's a 50-foot setback on each side of the creek that's filled with riparian plants and unfortunately Himalayan blackberry. And so when we started developing our property with native plants, we increased that habitat area, that green space, So we gave the wildlife more resources, we gave the birds more resources, and we also increased that habitat corridor that wildlife travel through up and down that creek. So it's not unusual to see bobcat on our property or coyote back at the creek, or foxes coming through the property, or skunks nesting here and then retreating back to the creek. So we've contributed to a larger green space, and we've given the animals more places to live their daily lives. So providing habitat is good for us. It's good for the environment, and of course it's good for our feathered friends. This is a little snapshot of one small section of our garden. Those are all native plants that you see, with the exception of the kiwi vine that's growing over the arbor. And to this day, I'm proud to say that over 30 species of songbirds have been documented nesting on our property or adjacent to it. We have recorded over 100 species throughout the year. And so that includes breeding season and migration, spring migration, fall migration, and then migratory species who spend the winter here. So I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Douglas Tallamy, but he says to restore biodiversity in our backyards, you need to plant native plants. So I know he's a smart guy, and he's a professor, and he's done all kinds of great research and published books and papers and things. But even if he didn't have that behind him to add to his credentials, I think that statement is accurate, because we've certainly seen it living out in real life in our garden. And we know that our garden is sustaining a lot of biodiversity, and it's very exciting, but it also is rewarding, and it makes me feel hopeful, because if I'm doing this and I know others are doing this, then I feel like there's a big movement for a lot of us to contribute healing some of these damaged landscapes into thriving and biodiverse ecosystems. So plant choices can literally stitch our landscape back together. Liz, is this where you wanted to do a poll question?
Yeah, I think it would make a lot of sense to do a poll question right now. So I am going to launch a poll. This will be anonymous, and we'll give it about 30 seconds for folks to respond. And I am going to do the food for birds question. All right, here we go. So for anybody calling in, this question reads, what are you currently doing to support songbirds and pollinators? And some of the options that we have provided include bird baths and bird feeders, or throwing seed in the garden, planting bird and pollinator friendly plants, or attending this webinar to learn. And if there is anything else that folks are doing to support our songbirds and pollinators, please feel free to drop those activities in the chat. We'd love to find out more about how you're interacting with these species. We'll give it about 10 more seconds here. Oh, nice. Sharon just planted milkweed, building nest boxes. That's great. All right, we're going to close in 3, 2, 1. So it looks like everybody is doing a lot, and a lot of people are here to learn. So thank you, Veronica and Daliax and the City of Cotati, for allowing this space for education.
Great. Great. Well, thank you all for being here. I really appreciate that. Excellent. Okay, great. So for those of you who are here to learn, you're probably wondering, where do I begin? How do I start transforming my space to support pollinators, songbirds, and biodiversity? So the first step is to start making that transition from alien ornamental or non-native plants to native plants. And the best place to begin with that process is to research the native flora and fauna that you have in your area. So plants that we have here in Sonoma County that are geographically native to our area may not necessarily be plants that would be appropriate to plant up in the Sierra foothills. So do your research. A great place to begin with that. And at the very end, I'll give you a list of resources, but I'll just tell you right now that the California Native Plant Society has a database called calscape.org. And you can just literally put your address into the database and it will populate a list of plants that are native to your area. And it'll even give you a list of native plant nurseries where you can go and purchase those plants. So in addition to removing, and you don't want to go in, I should also preface this by saying you don't want to just go in and bulldoze everything over because even non-natives for a period of time will have some function. For example, we have a hideous hedge of Escallonia on our property that I have not removed yet because it's a place of shelter. There isn't any food or other redeeming value that it offers other than it's a safe place for the birds to take cover and roost at night. So until some other native vegetation around it matures, I'm going to leave that hedge in. So think about those things when you're going to transform a space. Don't just gut everything. You want to do it thoughtfully and over time. So set up a plan, a succession plan, if you will, of things that you're going to remove and what you'll replace them with in terms of a native shrub, native meadow, a native tree, etc. If you have lawn, reduce it or even consider removing it. I know Daily Axe has done a lot of great projects in that, and they probably have a ton of wonderful information about how to effectively remove a lawn and how to transform it. And then think about, is there an opportunity to create corridors that connect to natural areas? So for example, where you live, does it abut a wildlife preserve? Is it adjacent to a larger property that is open space? Do you have a creek that runs near your property? So if you have something that's natural adjacent to you, think about how you can build on that. The other thing you should be mindful of too is if you do have a property or a backyard that abuts an open space area, take care in the kind of plant material that you utilize. So if there are some native plants that can be invasive, and if you plant one of those and it's not naturally occurring in that area, and it makes its way across the fence and into that open space habitat, it could be detrimental. So do some research about that as well. So there's some essential elements that you're going to think about when you're selecting plants and transforming your garden to a space that supports biodiversity. Obviously, you need to think about plants that provide food. You want to think about habitat structure, water source. You also want to think about stewardship, and we'll talk a lot more about actions you can take in the spirit of stewardship toward the end of the presentation. But, there are things that you're going to want to be mindful of in your garden and things that you want to do to take care of your garden so that you're not disrupting natural cycles of things. And make considerations for reducing and eliminating hazards and threats, invasive species, and pesticides. And we'll also talk more about hazards and threats toward the end of this presentation as well. So just remember that if we don't have native plants, then a healthy food chain ceases to exist. So the plants are the foundation of any healthy ecosystem. And if we don't have the proper plants, then we don't have the resources that our beneficial insects need to survive. And without our insects, we don't have food for our birds. And without birds, we don't have food for many of the native predators. And then, of course, there are other animals who rely on plants as well, like, for example, brush rabbits and deer. And although we may not view them as an asset to our garden sometimes, they are essential in our ecosystem. The brush rabbits here and I have an ongoing dance of how to keep pressure from one plant away from the rabbits versus another one. But it's also important to consider when we think about insects and we think about pollinators in particular, and how our native pollinators are 100% reliant on native plants to survive. How do we benefit from pollinators? Well, 1/3 of our food crops are pollinated by pollinator insects. So if we're not effectively supporting our pollinator insects, we're not really supporting the food that we need to eat as well. So we're all connected. So the important thing to know about insects is that they are specialists. They have unique relationships and physiological adaptations with their host plant lineage. And their host plants are native plants. So you can read a lot of older material about habitat gardening and pollinator gardens, and it'll be an extensive list of plant material, but not all of it will be a native plant. So it's really, really important to discern the difference between a host plant, meaning a plant that actually sustains the egg and larval form of that insect, versus a food plant. So those host plants for our insects are vital. And again, at the end, there'll be a great list of resources for you to check out. But going back to that calscape.org database from CNPS, they actually have a butterfly host plant database in there. So if you're really interested in host plants for butterflies, I highly recommend that resource. So 90% of our herbivorous insects can only eat the plants with which they've co-evolved. So that's really important. If you're only putting out nectar plants, you're missing an essential part of the puzzle there to sustain our pollinator insects. So a world without insects is a world without biological diversity. So here, this is a great little photo from a friend of mine. It's an adult warbling vireo who has found a succulent, delicious insect to feed its fledgling. And, he would not be able to do that were he not raising his young in an environment that had native plants that was sustaining their native insects. And when songbirds are being raised by their parents, they are receiving a 100% insect diet. That's an essential food source, not only to many adult songbirds, but to nearly all baby songbirds. So hopefully you've heard of Douglas Tallamy. If you haven't, I highly recommend either one of these books. I first read Bringing Nature Home a little over 10 years ago, and it was just so affirming that I was on the right track. But it was also discouraging because I learned that I had a lot more that I needed to do. So I'm happy to say I've done a lot of that. And his most recent book, Nature's Best Hope, lays out a really tangible blueprint for anyone who's just starting out in this. But I think it's also, the message of this recent book is empowering, because it basically says we can all be conservationists. We can all strive to heal the earth by doing a very specific set of steps. And again, it starts in your backyard. So I encourage you to read this. You can also hop onto YouTube, and Mr. Tallamy has given many presentations for all kinds of conservation groups all over the country. And you can just listen to one of his talks and be really inspired and get some great ideas about how you can start this journey, in addition to what you're going to learn here today. So we talked about how insects are specialists and how they have unique relationships with their host plant lineage. And those host plants allow those insects to lay eggs, which then hatch into larvae or caterpillars, if you will. And so caterpillars are baby bird food. They're a vital source of nutrition that adult birds capture, glean, forage for, and feed their offspring. Without that food resource, those adult birds are going to have very poor, low breeding success. So Mr. Talamy and some of his graduate students, and I think some scientists at the Smithsonian did some field research observing breeding birds in an urban area. And they were specifically looking at black-capped chickadees is what they would have back there. And they learned that a chickadee pair brings between 390 and 570 caterpillars to their nest for 16 days. So, and chestnut-back chickadee, which is our native chickadee species here in California, or more specifically in Sonoma County, their average clutch size is anywhere from 4 to 6 babies, 4 to 6 nestlings. So imagine that their parents need to find at least 400 to 600 larvae a day to feed their young for a little over 2 weeks. That's a lot of larvae. So they need to be in a pretty habitat-rich area to gather that much food just to successfully raise their babies to the point of getting ready to fledge the nest. But then once those babies fledge the nest, chickadee parents assume care for their young for approximately 3 more weeks. So we can almost triple that number of larvae that they're going to need to find to feed their young. So you can see that native plants are truly the foundation of the food web. Pollinators. All right, so pollinators, I think sometimes people just think, oh, butterflies and bees, but actually pollinators are a pretty large group of organisms. It's not just butterflies and bees, but it's also our moths and flies and wasps and beetles. Some of our birds and some of our bats are pollinators as well. And they are all dependent on these native plants. And depending on the plant choices we make for our gardens, that's going to create a certain type of habitat for specific insects that will support different stages of their life cycle. So when we talked about host plants for butterflies, that's basically the early stages of their life cycle. But we're also going to be thinking about food for them. So once the larvae is hatched and started to consume the leaves of the host plant, it's going to pupate and turn into whatever its adult form is, and then it's going to possibly need another type of plant for nectar sources. So remember that I mentioned that resource, calscape.org, where you can find a list of host plants for butterflies, native host plants for our native butterflies. They also include moths in that list as well. But if you really want to support them, you want to make sure that you have the right selection of native plants. So native landscapes, if you're using native plant material in your gardens, the statistics from the Xerces Society, which is an invertebrate conservation organization, estimates that a native landscape will support 35 times more caterpillar biomass than a non-native landscape. So just imagine the average garden, if one is filled primarily with ornamentals like roses and camellias and hydrangeas versus one that is filled with ceanothus and ribes and arctostaphylos and coyote brush, one is going to be a much more robust, vigorous environment to host our native insects versus the other. And making sure that you have plenty of native nectar and pollen sources in there for the adults is going to ensure that the entire life cycle of those pollinators is able to be carried out in that ecological space, known as your backyard. So moths and butterflies require nesting sites and shelter. They will lay their eggs on host plants, and that host plant can be a shrub or a tree or other types of non-woody plant material. And the host plants are going to provide essential food and shelter for the caterpillars once they're hatched. Some species are true specialists, meaning only one type of plant is useful to them at that particular stage. So for example, monarchs require milkweed, and be really careful about the milkweed. There's a lot of information out there a few years ago that was purporting tropical milkweed as a great source for monarchs, primarily a nectar source. Now there's a lot of conflicting information that's saying, you know, don't plant it at all. And it's not a native plant. So I think the most important thing is to acknowledge that and say native plants truly are the most beneficial. So stick with your native milkweed species. But 2/3 of host plants are shrubs and trees. And we're so lucky in California because we have such an amazing, well, we have an amazing diversity of plants and native plants, period. I think we have of this, all the states in the US, we have some of the highest plant diversity there is. So we're very lucky. But we have an amazing, even in Sonoma County, an amazing array of native trees. And oaks in particular, they're kind of, I don't know, I think they're iconic to California. They're one of my favorite trees, and they sustain a lot of life. So an oak tree can support more than 500 species of insects. And I think that that is remarkable, but it also tells us a lot about their role and importance in a healthy ecosystem. The coast live oak is one of my favorite trees. It's truly a life-giving tree. So here is that resource, Calscape, that I told you about, that has one, just a great resource to find what native plants are best for your area, but also confirmed host plants for butterflies and moths that are in your area. So this is just a little snapshot for Sonoma County, but it's an extensive list. So bees, there are hundreds and hundreds of species of native bees, and they have different needs for nesting. Some nest on the ground. Actually, I should correct that by saying some nest in the ground. Other species nest in cavities. Bee houses have become really popular. And we even made some and sold them here at one of our fundraising events, and learned later that there's actually a lot of management that you need to take on when you host a bee house, because they set up situations where there might be some unnatural predation of the bees' larvae in that man-made bee house, and there's also disease issues. So if you choose to use a bee house in your backyard, make sure you do your research and you know that there's some responsibility attached to that to ensure that the bees remain safe if they choose to use it. Cavity nesting bees really benefit from dead wood and hollow stems, and I'm going to show you a couple of photographs in a moment and make my case for not being a tidy gardener. Bumblebees benefit from leaf litter and plant clippings and bunch grasses. So again, with regard to not being a tidy gardener, I'm sure many of you have heard the mantra, leave the leaves. So what that means is during the fall, when our deciduous trees drop their leaves, to not dispose of those leaves, they're harboring life. They're harboring eggs of insects. They're harboring larvae and even pupae or pupa of different insect species. And the same is true for plant clippings. Our native bunch grasses, there's a practice of cutting them back so they don't look so rangy. And in the fall, all the wonderful green vegetation comes out. We do not cut back our bunch grasses here in the sanctuary gardens because there's a lot of insect life that's overwintering in those dead grass leaves in the bunch grasses for the winter. Don't go crazy with mulch. So this is a lesson that I had to learn because I was really a mulch addict for a while there. But it's really important to leave spaces of bare ground in your garden for our ground nesting bees. They can't dig through 2 and 3 inches of mulch effectively. So 70% of our native bees are ground nesters. While there are others who are cavity nesting, like the leafcutter and mason bees. And bumblebees really like piles of brush or heaps of vegetation, old vegetation, and die off in the understory of wild spaces. So, you know, they all have unique needs, just like our songbirds have unique needs. And we need to kind of think about that and think about areas of our gardens and community spaces and how we can provide for them in these unique ways. So this is a red elderberry in my garden, and a lot of people like to cut their elderberries back really hard so that in the spring there's lots of nice fresh growth. I don't. I never cut it back. I never have. Part of it was I was afraid to cut it back because I wasn't sure how to prune it. Now I just absolutely don't prune it back because I started observing titmice boring holes through the dead stalks of the elderberry, and I witnessed them extracting little larvae. Then learning more about our native bees, I realized, oh, well, this is, there are probably some native bees who have hollowed out some of these areas in the dying and dead stalks of the elderberry to nest and raise their young in. And so I can assure you the titmice did not eat all the bee larvae. There's probably a good healthy balance there because we have quite a few elderberry on our property, but the dead stalks of this elderberry provide essential nesting habitat for our bees and probably other insects, who then provide essential food for a lot of the different birds in our garden, but particularly titmice. And above all, if you want to be kind to your insects and your pollinators and your birds, please don't use pesticides in your gardens. Okay, let's talk about birds. So birds have, in my mind, the 4 basic food groups: insects, berries, nectar, nuts, and seeds. And there's a native plant that provides every single one of those food groups. There are multiple native plants that address each of those food groups. Insects, as we know, are the most important food item to provide for our native songbirds. Not only for the adult songbirds who are obligate insectivores, birds like warblers and vireos and swallows and swifts, but also 96% of our songbird species feed their babies only insects, whether they grow up to be omnivorous or granivores or frugivores. They are all raised as youngsters on a diet of insects. And the only way they can get those insects is if we are out there planting native plants for them. Creating a meadow space made up of grasses, annuals, and perennials are a great way to support certain groups of insects. Goldenrod, aster, and our native sunflower species are fantastic insectary annuals. Known caterpillar trees in our area are oaks and willows, any of our native oaks, any of our native willows. And in our garden in particular, I noticed that the shrubs that are the most laden with insects and the most used by our songbird species, particularly during the breeding season, are coyote brush, ceanothus or wild lilac, and coffeeberry. Those are super duper productive insectary plants. Here's a little section in our garden where you see coyote bush on the left, coffeeberry in the middle. Down in the foreground on the right is a plant called buckwheat. And in the background is a wild cherry species called Catalina cherry. It's native to Southern California. I planted it here in Sonoma County. It's doing great, but this little collection of 3 shrubs in particular, right around May, if you're walking in our garden and you then go around the corner toward this grouping, you actually hear these plants before you see them because they are laden with pollinators of all types. And then by June, it's just covered with birds who are gleaning insects off of these plants. And the coffeeberry, we'll talk about that later, and the cherry, we'll talk about that later as well, because they also provide fruit. But these are heavy hitter insectary plants. We have a lot of different songbird species that eat fruit. There's only one species that's an obligate frugivore, the cedar waxwing, but there are many other species who are omnivorous, like finches and mockingbirds and robins. So fruit will either, make up a small portion of their diet during certain times of year, and then other times of the year, it might be more than 50% of their diet. That is dependent on food availability. So if we stick with our native plants, then we know that our food pantry is seasonal and changing with the needs of the birds in our garden. So for example, the coffeeberry is ripening in the fall when certain songbirds are preparing to migrate. A lot of our migratory songbirds like western tanager, hooded oriole, black-headed grosbeak, they will load up on fruit to help them lay down fat stores for the migration. And coffeeberry is a really popular item in our garden with western tanagers. During the winter, we might see flocks of cedar waxwings and flocks of American robins all over our native Toyon, whose common name is Christmasberry. And that's because it's red with berries, ripe with berries during December and January. So whenever I buy a new plant for the garden, I think of first, how does this serve the songbirds? And if it provides food, what time of year does it provide food? So we have available food in our garden for each trophic category, whether it's a fruit-eating bird, insect-eating bird, or a seed-eating bird, every season of the year. So of our fruit and berry producing natives, we have some that produce fruit during the spring, some that produce fruit during summer, some during fall, and some during winter. So we make sure that our fruit-eating birds have something year-round available to them in our garden. So this would be the Toyon on the right. This is probably a photo that was taken in late November because they don't look quite ripe yet. But then you'll see on the left a smaller, lower shrub, and that's the coffeeberry, which has absolutely no berries on it because it was ripe back in September, October, and the western tanagers and black-headed grosbeaks stripped it clean. And here is a western tanager eating a coffeeberry. And cedar waxwings gorging on native Toyon. There are hundreds of native plants that provide nectar. So remember that a lot of our plants that provide nectar for our songbirds also provide nectar for our pollinators. Ribes are wonderful. And manzanita or Arctostophilus, those are two plants that provide nectar during the winter. So late December, January, February, those two plants are in bloom. The hummingbirds are feeding on them. If for some odd reason bees emerge prematurely, they will be feeding on them as well. We had pipevine swallowtail butterflies coming around in the garden a couple of weeks ago, and they were very busy nectaring on golden currant, which is a native ribes. So there are a lot of ways that you can provide natural nectar sources in your garden, even in the winter. But again, it's a seasonal pantry that your goal is to provide food for these guys. So there are things that are in flower every season of the year. Just, be thoughtful about your native plant selections, and you can't go wrong. Buckwheat and monkey flower are just exploding all summer long, and they're absolutely beautiful plants to have in the garden. Nuts and seeds. Trees, of course, are a fantastic source of nuts and seeds. Obviously, our native oaks are, a foundation to nuts for a lot of species, not just birds, but different native mammals as well. And then other trees like alder and pine and ash and fir and sycamore are other great sources of nuts and seeds. There's a wide range of shrubs. So there's a plant, it's called atriplex or saltbush, and there's another plant in that family called quailbush. Those are what I call the bird feeder replacement plants. So you've probably heard a little something about pine siskins this winter and them becoming sick with a bacterial infection called salmonellosis. And we know that bird feeders are directly responsible for the transmission of this lethal bacteria. A great replacement for bird feeders is a saltbush plant. Finches, goldfinches, house finches, purple finches, the pine siskins here in our garden love saltbush. They nibble the tender tips of the plant. During the breeding season, they regurgitate that and they feed it to their young. So, and it's a beautiful shrub. It's kind of a gray-green foliage and it's evergreen. So it's lush and dense all year round, but it's a fantastic plant to replace your bird feeders and satisfy the needs of your seed-eating birds in your garden, as is any of our native sagebrushes, Artemisia, and coyote brush is a great shrub to have. And then of course, many of our native grasses, when they go to seed, don't deadhead them, leave that on there, leave those dead and dying stalks on there, because the birds, particularly goldfinches, won't hesitate to alight on there and extract the seeds. And then a lot of our ground feeding seed eaters like towhees and juncos will be scratching around in the soil beneath those grasses and those shrubs to pick up the seeds. And then we have all kinds of wonderful annuals, like I mentioned earlier, the aster and the goldenrod, but also yarrow, seaside daisy, any of our native buckwheat species. Excellent sources of nectar, very beneficial to insects, but when they go to seed, they're a vital resource of food for all of our ground foraging sparrow and finch species. So when late September arrives and all of the white-crowned and the golden-crowned sparrows and the fox sparrows arrive, a lot of the dark-eyed juncos are migratory, they'll be coming in, they're going to be looking for seed sources. And all of these plants provide that for them. And again, this makes a great case for not being a tidy gardener. Don't deadhead your annuals and perennials. Let the birds take care of it for you. Or if you just can't resist and you do need to deadhead them, take that material once you've cut it off and tuck it back down on the ground at the base of the plants. Use it as mulch, but make those seeds available to the songbirds. And there's going to be overwintering insects or life cycles of insects within that plant material as well. So by not disposing of it or chopping it up as mulch, you're going to leave them intact so they can either, one, carry out their life cycle, or two, be a food source to the birds. So in the upper right, you can see a male house finch enjoying some of the salt bush. He's having a little meal there. And then we've got a white-crowned sparrow who's nibbling on some of the coyote bush. This is probably late fall. He's extracting the seeds and making a good meal out of that. And then on the left is, you can look at this selection of plants in a variety of different ways. They can be pollinator plants, which they are. They can be insectary plants, which they are. And they can also be a great source of nectar for hummingbirds. There's a lot of hummingbird plants in there. And they also are excellent seed sources. Every single one of them is a tremendously wonderful seed source for seed-eating birds. So you've got sticky monkey flower in the foreground. In the background, you have California buckwheat. In the middle there, you have a sort of native verbena. It's not really native to this area, but I will tell you that the pipevine swallowtail loves that plant. And then seaside daisy, which is there on the left. All of those are great sources of food for a whole bunch of different organisms, but particularly seed-eating songbirds. This is a terrible photo of a container garden to say that if you have a smaller space like a patio, and you still want to contribute to this effort of restoring the landscape with native plants, you can do that in a small space, absolutely. There are a lot of different native plants that are amenable to being grown in containers. And I'll give you a couple of resources to go to so that you can get some ideas and make some good plant choices. But even by providing native plants in a small space in containers, you're still contributing to biodiversity. You're still providing a home for someone. You're still providing a vital food source for someone. When we go to create a garden that is to support any kind of biodiversity, but particularly songbirds, you need to think about that space as a habitat. And you need to consider the different layers that are in that habitat. So we've got an understory layer, a mid-story layer, and the overstory, or the canopy, if you will. And the birds use those different layers in different ways. So shelter obviously is going to be a primary component of those habitat layers. We have birds who will nest on the ground. Like you see that nest in the upper left, that's actually a spotted towhee nest. It is on the ground in the middle of a patch of hummingbird sage. Then we've got a California towhee that's on the right, who is about 4 feet off the ground, nesting right in the middle of the Catalina cherry that I showed you a photo of earlier. And then we have an Anna's hummingbird down in the lower left who's nesting way up high in a live oak tree. So it's really important as we're creating space for the wildlife that we're creating spaces they can use for all aspects of their life history. Cavity nesting species are having a really hard time right now. They have lost a lot of homes due to wildfires. They've lost a lot of homes due to wildfire prevention. People are very concerned about having dead and dying trees on their property. And so they're clearing them out, which leaves our cavity nesting species virtually homeless. So when we have cavity nesting species in our area, if you know that there aren't sufficient natural sites for them, consider putting up a nest box if it is safe for you to do that. And there's a whole list of responsibilities that come with hosting a nest box, and there are lots of great resources, including our website, that you can go to really find out what's entailed in hosting a nest box. But it's not just as simple as slapping it up and being done with it. There's some management that goes into it, but it is one way that you can provide an alternative nesting site for cavity nesters. Other homes or forms of shelter to consider, not just for birds, but for insects and for reptiles, would be rocks and logs. So this is an example in our garden of some space for homes for some of these little guys. So western fence lizards, gopher snakes. We have a lot of old branches of trees that rather than having the arborist chip them up, we've used them to line pathways or just had little random stacks of them here and there. They're filled with life, but they are also essential homes to our slender salamander, alligator lizards, western fence lizards. So nooks and crannies of natural elements are a great way to provide homes for other members of your biodiverse community in your backyard. Thinking about dead trees not, they have a lot of life after they're dead. They sustain a lot of life. So I talked about cavity nesters. We also have some species that depend on them to store their food, like the acorn woodpecker. They use dead and dying trees to create their winter granaries. So they have food to last through the winter and the spring. And when those trees fall to the ground, they decompose and they add nutrients back into our soils. And they also are home to a lot of insects that maybe require dead and dying wood material to fulfill their life stage, but also while they're in there in the larval form or adult form, they're a source of food not only to birds, but there are a lot of mammals. So when we have a lot of those decaying logs and branches on our pathways, I know that they're rich with insect life when I see that the skunk has torn them apart and has picked out all the goodies. So there's a lot of life in a dead tree. So when you can keep them intact and on your property, when it's safe for you to do that, I really encourage you to do so. And here's an example of one of our rustic pathways that are lined with some of the material from fall tree trimming that we've done on the property. So generally any material like that, we don't take off the property, we integrate it back into the landscape. So water is an important element for your butterflies, for your other pollinators, for your alligator lizards, and for our songbirds, of course. And you can provide a water element in your garden as simply as using a plant saucer that you change the water out and keep fresh every day, to something, you know, a little more elaborate like a pond or a water fountain. But water is a magnet for all life. So always think about incorporating a water feature in your garden. Water also can play another important role. So this is a glimpse of part of our basin and swale system in our garden. When we have rain, and it's a good rain event, these basins and swales will fill up with water and stay on our land rather than rolling off into our neighbor's property. And they'll sink back down into the aquifer, which is great. But we also have berms around all of these swales and basins that are planted with different types of plant communities. And when those rain events happen, it saturates those berms, it nourishes those plants, and that's essentially our irrigation system. We don't have an irrigation system in our garden. Pretty much everything sustains on rainwater, and all of the plants that we have, with the exception of some of the riparian plants, have evolved to have a dry summer. Now, I will admit last summer was exceptionally dry, and we did turn on some hoses and attach some sprinklers here and there. And I'm afraid it's looking like we'll probably have to do the same thing this summer as well. But for the most part, if it was a normal rain year, we wouldn't have to worry about any irrigation in our garden because of the plant material that we've used. Something else that we can do to support the biodiversity in our backyards is protect the breeding birds. So tree trimming and vegetation removal should occur in the fall and winter. Think about this tiny Anna's hummingbird. Think about this tiny nest that's barely the size of a half of a walnut shell. Most people are not going to be able to see that. Songbirds are masters at concealing their nests. They're a prey species, so their entire livelihood depends on being able to successfully conceal their nests and their young from predators, which is what makes it very difficult for someone working out in the backyard and doing some pruning or trimming a hedge to notice a small songbird nest. So it's best not to do any of these activities during the breeding season. In California, the breeding season officially started February 14th and it ends September 7th or September 15th. So between those dates is not a safe time to be removing vegetation in the garden. So leaving the leaves. So I talked a little bit earlier about trying not to be too much of a neatnik in the garden. And we talked about the value of leaving leaves and not deadheading our annuals and our perennials. But the other important thing about leaves, aside from the fact that it's going to be homes for overwintering insects in their various life stage, and also those insects are going to provide essential food sources for some of our songbirds during the winter. But these leaves are going to decompose and they're going to add vital nutrients back into the soil. And they probably won't all be broken down by the time summer rolls around. And so that layer of leaf material in your garden beds is going to be very useful in holding moisture in the soil during the middle of summer. So leave the leaves when you can. If you chop them up and mulch them, you're damaging all of that insect life in them. So find a place, if you just really can't bear having them in sight in your garden, find a place somewhere that you can stuff them away, pile them up in a mound, but please don't stick them in a plastic bag and put them in the waste bin or dump them in the green bin to go off to the landfill. This is probably something that's not talked about enough, but it has catastrophic effects on all kinds of life forms and is very damaging to biodiversity, and that is light pollution. And I'm not talking about light pollution from large city centers, although that is very bad as well. I'm talking about the porch lights and the security lights that we have just on our rural and urban properties. All of that contributes to light pollution. And it interferes and alters biological activities of all kinds of plants and animals. So when we think about pollinators in particular, moths, mostly many nocturnal species of moths, are attracted to light. And if they're attracted to light when they should be out pollinating plants in the middle of the night, or maybe serving as food for someone the following day, they're going to die as they're attracted to that porch light that's on 24/7. They're going to fall to the ground. They're not going to go do their job in our ecosystem. We already know that insect populations are in decline, and there are many insect species, even if they're not nocturnal, that are attracted to artificial light sources during the night. So 1/3 of these insects that are trapped in these light sources at night die by morning. So they're not out there procreating, they're not out there serving as food sources and keeping our ecosystems healthy. Light pollution also impacts our migratory songbirds. So that light, as it emits into the night sky, causes songbirds to go off course. They will go off course, they will not be on their migratory path, they could overshoot their destination or go in the completely wrong direction, but they're also drawn into these areas of light pollution. They become confused and disoriented, and very often they'll get into city centers, they'll collide with buildings and communication towers. Millions of songbirds fall to their death every spring and fall migration due to light pollution. So I really encourage you, we're very responsible about lights. We don't have any outdoor lights on our property. They can be used if needed, but for the most part, we have all outdoor lighting off. There's also great studies that show that if it's for security purposes, that actually is a fallacy, that crime goes up with well-lit areas. So maybe, if you have lights out for security, put them on a motion sensor. The other thing you can do is make sure that any light source that you have outdoors at night is shielded and only directing the light downward rather than causing light scatter and putting that light out into your neighbor's yard or across the creek or up into the sky, but focusing the light down into a pathway or over your front door, but don't allow the light to scatter because that is what contributes to the light pollution. We touched earlier about eliminating threats. So we're transforming our garden space or our community space into a thriving ecosystem that supports biodiversity, but there are a couple of threats that we may not have considered that could impede the success of our efforts. So free roaming cats, I can tell you as a wildlife rehabilitator of over 20 years, have a devastating impact on our native songbirds. Here at Songbird Care, over 50% of the songbirds that we receive from our community are victims of free roaming cats. So we don't need a bunch of scientific papers to tell us that cats are having a catastrophic impact on our native songbirds. They also have an impact on our native reptiles and amphibians and small mammals. So truly, for the safety of our wildlife, but also the well-being of cats, they should be contained. So fortunately, there's this fabulous creation called a catio, a cat patio. It's an enclosure where cats have access to the outdoors, sunshine, fresh air, but they are safely contained. So they can't run out into the street, accidentally be hit by a car. They can't go getting into a fight with a neighborhood cat, but they also can't prey on our native songbirds. Window collisions are another serious threat to songbirds. So window collisions, if you don't know, what happens is if a window is reflecting the surrounding environment, the reason a bird flies into the window is they mistake that reflection for the surrounding environment, and they think that it is clear passage to fly through the sky that's being reflected in the window, only to be met with a solid surface. So if you have windows that are known to cause collisions for our songbirds, there are a lot of different techniques that you can use to eliminate that reflective surface. One of the ideas that you see here is paracord that is strung every 4 inches across the window. The paracord is secured in something called a J channel. We've done something similar here at our clinic. We didn't use a J channel. We actually just used a staple gun and stapled the paracord to the top of the windowsill and the bottom of the windowsill, and it works beautifully. But there are a lot of products that you can buy and a lot of do-it-yourself ideas. The American Bird Conservancy, abcbirds.org, has a lot of wonderful techniques that you can implement to prevent window collisions. So window collisions claim the lives of billions of birds every year in North America, and it's a totally preventable problem. So creating habitat in your backyard and managing those threats and hazards helps build resilient bird and insect populations. So when we select native plants for our gardens, we know that those native plants are doing good work for our insects, but those insects are also providing essential food for young songbirds and for adult songbirds. And the plant material is providing a whole host of nesting sites and sources of shelter for our birds and our bees and butterflies and other insect and members of our biodiverse community. And if we make plant food or plant choices as food sources for songbirds, and we think about that seasonal pantry, then we can ensure that there's food available year round for the breeding season for winter, but also for spring and fall migration. And we can ensure by implementing all of these principles when we're creating a native plant garden that we've provided something where the birds can survive and thrive through each cycle, each life cycle, and each season. And by the way, this is a cedar waxwing in the middle, late winter, I'll say, and he's on a box elder. And I put this picture in here specifically to tell you that a lot of the buds on our native trees are enjoyed by cedar waxwings. And in particular, they really enjoy the buds on the box elder. So if you're needing a beautiful native deciduous tree, I highly recommend the box elder. Also keep in mind that native plant gardens are climate friendly because they are relatively low maintenance. So you're not going to need to use lawnmowers or fertilizers, which helps not using those things reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And because of how our California native plants have evolved, they are water wise. They have evolved to live in a relatively summer dry climate. And if we're going to really focus our efforts on creating a garden that utilizes native plants and sustains biodiversity, we're probably not going to have a lawn in that garden, or we're going to have a very tiny lawn, or you're going to have a lawn that you have transitioned into using native grasses for that lawn-like turf. And thank you very much. And I think we can open it up for questions. Oh, I'll leave this up here for a minute. These are what we consider habitat heroes. These are some of our favorite plants in native songbird sanctuary gardens. And then the next slide that I'll show you is a list of resources, but I'll leave this up here for a minute if you want to take a look. And then Liz, I think you had another poll question you were going to give.
Yeah, I've got a few poll questions left. We just kind of wanted to get a gauge of who is in the audience. And maybe I'll just go ahead and launch this first one asking about folks' experience with different native plants. And all right, I'm going to launch this poll. And again, for anybody who is calling in, the question is, what experience do you have with native plant species? And some of the options that we have provided are, I have some familiarity, I have a native garden at home, or I tend to one nearby. I can refer to most species by their Latin name, or I'm pretty new to gardening and I'm eager to learn. These type of questions just really help us, again, gauge who's in the audience, and also might influence what some of the resources we share with you all after the fact will include. And Veronica, thank you so much for your time and for the presentation. I know that I've seen this is my second time now, and I think every time I just learn something new, and you're such a wealth of knowledge. So I just want to thank you so much for your time.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure, absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and end this poll. All righty. So it looks like we have a somewhere in between. Some people are a little bit familiar, and a lot of people are just really eager to learn. We've got a few folks who are just about experts and can name most species by name. And that's just a really fun question for us. And I think now we'll go ahead and transition into the Q&A. We've got a lot of it, and so thank you everybody who submitted a question. I'm sure we'll go a little bit over 5:30, and I understand completely if folks need to drop off, but let's dive into some more juicy material. So we have our first question asking about a tall rubber tree in the native garden, wondering if, since everything around this rubber tree is native, if they should be cutting down this non-native tree.
That's a really good question. So as I said earlier, you know, when we start making that transition into all natives, and you're working with a lot of ornamentals and non-natives already in that space, you do want to embrace the process as a transition. So I would think about the role that that tree is serving right now. And do you have something that you've already selected that would be a good replacement for it, that you could start in another part of your yard? Or if that space is the only space you have for that tree, you know, what is that process going to look like for you if you need to remove it? How does that impact what you already have established down below? And you could also think about, how is the presence of the rubber tree impacting the natives that you have down below in the understory and surrounding it? Would they benefit by its removal, or would they be hindered by it? So I think you need to take a more holistic view when you make decisions like that. And to my knowledge, a rubber tree is not invasive. So that's another thing too, is when you're dealing with invasive non-natives, those should be first on your list for removal when you're transitioning into natives.
Fantastic, thank you. Oh, we've got a lot of questions coming in now. All right, so next question is about bird habitat in noisy areas. This individual describes that they're about a quarter mile away from the freeway and is wondering if highly intensive or noisy areas would affect birds and habitat?
So there are always going to be birds who are better able to occupy places like that. More sensitive species are going to find those areas that are more conducive for them to live. But there are species who, they do okay in an urban environment. And so by providing better and more resources for them, you're just going to basically make life a little bit easier. They've obviously found a way to deal with the noise factor. Although there are a lot of studies out now that show the impact of noise pollution on our songbird species, there are probably some species that are doing okay with it, as you've observed in your backyard. But if you provide natives, then you're only doing them a great service by, providing more shelter and more food resources for them.
Great, thank you. How would you increase the caterpillar population? Is that based on the plants that you have?
Yes, it's solely based on the plants that we have, absolutely. And also the oaks. So I did a count of how many native oaks we have on our property, but it's a lot. And we've also added a few different willow trees in there. And so I would definitely say that the oaks are probably the primary life giver to caterpillars, especially early in the spring when a lot of our native species have already built their nest and they're actively raising chicks. You can see them almost exclusively in the oaks, gathering caterpillars that have emerged from different species. So again, thinking about doing your research to know what kinds of insects are in your area, what types of butterflies are native to your area, moths, etc., and their specific host plants, that's the direction that you want to go in order to make those decisions.
That's great, thank you. Is there anything beneficial about yellow jackets nesting in a dirt hole or possibly nesting in an old gopher tunnel?
Personally, I can't think of anything beneficial, but I have read that yellow jackets can contribute to some aspect of pollination. But in my mind, in our garden, we have so many other native pollinators that I usually am just waiting for Mr. or Mrs. Skunk to discover that yellow jacket nest and eradicate it for me. So I don't strive to foster yellow jackets.
Yeah, I'm with you there. When can you remove dead leaf litter? This individual is worried about having too much on site during fire season.
Right. So there are a couple of good resources. I know the Sonoma Ecology Center has a Firewise gardening guide, and our friends at the Habitat Corridor Project, I think, collaborated, as well as our Native Plant Society collaborated on that. You guys probably at Dailyx have good information, but they do address that, because I think when there was this information being pushed out into the community about get rid of leaf litter, chop down every dead and dying tree. Many of us who are really promoting creating habitat in the backyard were a little bit like, wait a minute, you're killing a lot of stuff when you're doing that. So I think there are safe ways, if you're in a fire-prone area, to manage things like leaf litter, so that it can still be productive, still fulfill its essential role in a garden, but also maintain Firewise gardening standards. So I'd look to some of those resources, and I thank you for that question, because it's probably, I need to put some links to that in our page here.
Absolutely, yeah, thank you. I too would advocate for folks to check out the Resilient Landscape Coalition, which is a combination of Master Gardeners, Sonoma Ecology Center, and the Habitat Corridor Project, and they too are a wealth of knowledge. So certainly check those out, and that can also be a resource that we share in that follow-up email. So thank you for that question. It's a very important one. How do we find which native plants are dangerous for dogs?
Oh gosh, so I think the California Native Plant Society published an article not long ago. Do you have awareness of this, Liz?
No, I'm making note.
So go to the California Native Plant Society's website. They have a great search box. Put in dog-friendly plants or something to that effect. And it seems to me it was something recent that came up, and I'm part of their Garden Ambassadors program. And I know a few webinars ago, we had a meeting about it, and I know someone published a list. So take a look on their website. And if it's not on their website, send them an email through their contact form on the website, and I'm sure they'll get right back to you with that list.
Nice, thank you. You may have touched on this a little bit, but we did have this recurring question about if you advocate for taking down bird feeders because of the salmonella.
Yes, I do. Right. Yeah. In general, we don't advocate for bird feeders because we advocate for supporting songbirds through native plants. And there's a whole host of problems with bird feeders. Disease is just one of them. But with regard to the pine siskins, Fish and Game issued a warning saying, please ask your communities to take bird feeders down, leave them down through April 1st. Well, the problem with that now is that, we're expecting the pine siskins to head back north any day. They're probably already departing for their northern breeding grounds, but because the bacteria was so virulent and ripped through their populations, and they started to infect their close relatives, the goldfinches. And then the goldfinches started to infect our house finches and the purple finches. And so now we're seeing 4 species infected with the bacteria. The house finches and the goldfinches are here year round, and they're just starting their breeding season. So as a kindness to them, please keep your bird feeders down, because we don't want parents raising young and then there's young becoming sick with the salmonella as well. So I would say just take your bird feeders down. Don't worry about putting them up until fall. It's spring now. So everything our wildlife needs in a reasonably healthy ecosystem is out there. Insects are emerging to feed their young. Plant material is emerging to feed the young of species who need that. So bird feeders really are not necessary for our birds. It's a human enjoyment thing. And I think we can put that on hold for the well-being of the birds.
Yeah, really great point. Thank you so much for addressing that. Do you have any suggestions for habitat gardening in more shade?
We have so much shade on our property. So I am very familiar with the challenges of shade. And again, going to calscape.org, putting in your address, it will populate a list of plants, and it will be broken out into categories, or you can select categories to say, give me a list of shade plants for my area. And that is essentially how I've cultivated all the shady areas on our property. Is I deferred to Calscape, and then I went to our local nursery, CalFlora, and talked with them. And they also gave great guidance about plants that would have great habitat value, but also do well in those conditions.
That's fantastic. Thank you. What are some natives that you would suggest for containers?
So when I put our little demonstration garden together with container plants, we had some of the native sunflower, woolly sunflower in there. Seaside daisy did really well in a container. Our native aster did very well in a container. I put a couple of juncus in containers just to see what would happen, and they were very happy in there. And oh gosh, there are a couple of other things as well. It's escaping me, Lysengia, which is a form of aster as well. So a lot of those did well. I think I have a Dudleya, a couple of Dudleya in them, and there's pollinators that like the Dudleya. So there's quite a few. And then there are actually quite a few shrubs that will do very well in larger containers too. I've seen a lot of really beautiful Arctostaphylos, smaller forms of Arctostaphylos do well in containers.
That's fantastic. How about blackberries? Would you say that blackberries are good for songbirds?
Well, they certainly know how to make use of them. They certainly know how to find shelter and nesting sites in blackberries, and they, enjoy the berries as well. But the problem with blackberries is they can choke out a lot of native vegetation, so they will ruin a habitat. And if you have them, and it's a constant battle in our garden. a constant battle in our garden dealing with the blackberries. So, you know, just try and stay on top of it as much as you can. I've met people who have managed their blackberry patches because they personally like the blackberries. But, you know, they accept the fact that it is an ongoing management issue.
Yeah, so true. Those blackberries are
And we
ferocious.
have native blackberries, by the way, so.
That's fantastic. Let's see here. Oh, I love this question. Are there any native gardens that the public can tour?
Yes, there are lots of native gardens that the public can tour. So I'll give you one resource to go to, and that is, again, the California Native Plant Society's Garden Ambassadors page. Our garden is a member of that program, and there are many other residential gardens that are part of that program. And many of the hosts of those gardens make the gardens publicly available on certain occasions or during certain times of the year. The California Native Plant Society chapters throughout California host native plant garden tours. So usually late April through mid-May, a lot of our chapters are hosting tours. They select gardens in the communities that may be public gardens or private gardens. And then you join this tour and you can go visit as many gardens as you can in one day or a weekend to get ideas and see them. Our garden, we closed it last summer because of COVID. We have now decided upon a way where we can open it back up to the public again. So we're going to do it by appointment only. And people will need to bring a smartphone with them because they'll do a self-guided tour through the garden using QR codes to learn more about certain plant installations and how that particular grouping serves the songbirds or the pollinators, or how to learn the different identifications of certain plants that are really important in our garden. So be on the lookout on our Facebook page and our website for more information about when we are finally able to open up our garden again, because that's something that we really enjoy being able to do.
Oh, fantastic. I can't wait to be able to tour that myself. Thank you. And somebody actually did remind me that there is going to be an eco-friendly garden tour on May 15th. It will be entirely virtual, and we'll be sure to send some resources for that as well to be able to view some public as well as residential, native, and beautiful landscapes. We've got a few folks in the questions asking for your own experience and expertise and suggestions for things such as small native trees or fruits and vegetables or shade-loving plants.
Okay, well, fruits and vegetables, you guys are going to be better equipped to address those questions. Small native trees, gosh, you know, that's a really good question. And I have to say that I don't have a good answer. There are some forms of Ceanothus and Arctostaphylos that can be, you know, sort of shaped to be tree-like in their mature form and be more of a dwarf small-scale tree in the landscape. But, you know, our oaks get really big, and I'm looking at our shining willow out the office window here, and shining willow is a native willow, and it's huge and it grows fast. So I wouldn't recommend that. But again, probably deferring to Calscape and your local native plant nursery to get guidance on that is going to be the best way to go.
Absolutely. Yeah, such an amazing resource. Thank you for sharing that one. We have someone asking for clarification about the salmonella and bird fountains, if you would suggest taking those bird fountains down or if they are an extreme vector.
So if the water is circulating, there is less risk of it being a vector. If the water is stagnant, then the water needs to be changed out on a regular basis, or it just needs to be emptied and put in dormancy for a little while.
That's good to know. Do you have any suggestions for handling yellow jackets in a pathway?
I would say call Marin, mosquito, and vector control. Marin, Sonoma, mosquito, and vector control. It's a long one, but they're based in Cotati. They're very helpful in finding solutions to problems like that.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, I think we have actually just about wrapped up this Q&A. We had a nice time with folks chiming in as well for different suggestions of plants. Somebody just recommended ribes as a small tree, and I can attest that that is a totally beautiful plant. I would highly
There's one in the photo right here.
Fantastic. Well, I think with that, we'll get ready to officially wrap up, and we have a few closing slides for some upcoming events. And again, Veronica, I just cannot express enough. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise. And I'm sure the questions will continue to be coming, and I look forward to sharing resources with everybody in a follow-up email, ideally sometime this week.
Great.
Yeah, thank you, Veronica. I could go on and on about how much I enjoyed that, but since we're over time, I'll just go through these slides nice and quick for us.
Sorry, guys.
Oh, no, I could have listened a lot longer. So at Daily Acts, we have a couple of really excellent events coming up for the city of Petaluma. Very soon, we have a pollution prevention webinar series, kind of inspired by the dredging of the Petaluma River, which yielded not just all the silt that needed to be removed, but also about 10 years worth of garbage. So we're going to be talking about how to prevent all kinds of pollution, not just plastic and solid waste, but from household sources, landscapes sources, and more. So that'll be a really excellent event. Some Daily Ag staff and some local experts. So be sure to tune into those. As always, many, many thanks to our wonderful sponsors, without whom we couldn't do the work that we do. And that's really all. I just want to express our gratitude for you all for joining us, and again to you, Veronica, for sharing that wonderful and informative presentation with us. We're gonna send you the follow-up email in the next day or two that'll include the recording and all of these resources that we've been going over. After that, if you have other questions, feel free to reach out to me. This is my contact info on the screen. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your evening.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody. Have a great evening. Happy gardening.
Yes, happy gardening.
All right, everybody. Take care. Have a great night.